Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my Endless Diary Tales channel? Thank you so much. In the 5th year of our childless marriage, my husband fathered children outside. Not just one but multiple with another woman. This woman wasn't rushing to become his legal wife. She had meticulously calculated the gains and losses in the situation. Currently, my husband and I were childless, but according to the law, illegitimate children also had inheritance rights. Therefore, she didn't need to rush into marriage. Either way, her children could inherit the fortune that my husband and I had struggled to build for half our lives. After learning the truth, I thought long and hard. Divorce? Even if I divorced, I could get more than half of the assets, but the remainder would still be enough for them to live lavishly for generations. That would be too convenient for them. I would never let that happen. If that was the case, I'd rather go bankrupt. Anyway, I was alone and wouldn't starve. I wanted to see how those illegitimate children would live without inheriting a single penny. I found out about Tom's affair when his illegitimate child started kindergarten. She was even planning to have a second one. The reason I knew was because Tom's family was far from upright. They had been colluding to conceal Tom's whereabouts for years. I found out because the woman was pregnant with her second child. Unexpectedly, Tom took her to a clinic, and someone photographed Tom entering an obstetrics and gynecology clinic and gave it to me. I stared blankly at the photo for 2 minutes. The anger hadn't even erupted before it was suppressed by reason. Having spent years navigating the business world, I was past the age of impulsive actions without understanding the whole picture. I wouldn't rush to confront Tom. I spent a large sum to hire someone to investigate. Within 2 days, everything Tom had been hiding was exposed. 4 years ago, Tom secretly started supporting a recent female college graduate. 3 years ago, this woman gave birth to his son. Currently, she was pregnant again, rumored to be twins. No wonder Tom's mother hadn't urged me to have children in recent years. I thought she had given up because she was afraid we were infertile. It turned out she already had grandchildren. After learning about Tom's affair, I tried to suppress my anger and didn't go looking for him. His affair was an undeniable truth. No matter how much I argued with him, divorce was inevitable. What I needed to think about now was how to divorce in a way that benefited me the most. In the life of an adult, interests must come first. I found a quiet place and stayed there for the entire afternoon, recalling our 15 years of marriage. In reality, not having children was Tom's suggestion from the start. Unexpectedly, the one who regretted it in the end was him. In the early years, we were both starting our careers with no money, no connections, and no family support. To be honest, we went through a lot of hardship. Yet thinking back, the first thing he did after achieving success was to find a younger woman to bear him a child. How ridiculous! In just one afternoon, I consulted several lawyers. Their answers were all the same. We had no prenuptial or marital agreement, so if Tom was the one who had the affair first, unless he agreed to leave empty-handed, which was impossible, this path was blocked. I had to quickly think of another way. Just then Tom called. He asked why I wasn't home yet. I looked at the clock. It was already past 10 p.m. Over the years, although he secretly established another family outside, he hid it very well. Except for occasional late returns due to work, he would be home before 10 p.m. every night. This was also why I had never suspected him of having an affair for so many years. I had forgotten that someone who truly wants to cheat doesn't need much time. When I got home, it was already 11 p.m. Tom was sitting on the sofa talking on the phone. Hearing the sound of the door opening, he suddenly turned his head. The middle-aged man in his 40s, not short-sighted, not balding, looked mature and composed, carrying some traces of time. But I also clearly saw that he pressed the end call button and flipped the screen face down on the coffee table. Details that I had never noticed before were now infinitely magnified in my mind. Once suspicion arose, everything became suspicious. He walked towards me as usual, taking the handbag from my hand. I smiled faintly and said, "Why are you so late? Are you tired?" I was stunned for a moment, unable to believe how someone who had betrayed their marriage could not show a trace of guilt. For 4 years, he had hidden it so meticulously, chilling me with his careful calculation. Perhaps because he did receive a response from me, Tom's expression became even more unpleasant. "What's wrong?" I turned my face away, trying to maintain composure, and said, It's nothing, just a little tired. Having lived together for over 20 years, Tom knew me very well. Just by looking at my actions, he could sense something was wrong. Of course, I was the same. I knew that this time the photo of him taking the woman to the prenatal clinic was not accidental, nor was it intentional. It was just that he no longer bothered to hide it like before. The company had entered a stable phase. Tom and I shared all the hardships during the startup process, but some people only wanted to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Based on what I casually responded to Tom with a few words, not revealing any signs that I knew about his affair, perhaps Tom still didn't know that I had investigated everything. So he continued to act as usual. It's just that the number of times he checked his phone was a little more frequent. For old married couples, sometimes silence is also a form of happiness. But there are also people who are not satisfied with silence. Anger kept surging in my heart. I wanted to scream, to make a scene, to punch Tom in the face. I wanted to scream and frantically question him why he betrayed our marriage. I even thought about retaliating with a similar affair. But when those surging emotions, I felt myself in that moment become disgusting and terrifying. The marriage betrayer deserved punishment, but the prerequisite for punishing others was not to hurt myself. Tom was already bad enough. Did I also want to make myself as bad as him? I knew I had been deceiving him for too long, but the transfer of assets also needed time. A man who cheated was like a piece of paper thrown into a cesspool, making people disgusted. 20 years of affection and all the storms we had weathered together, upon learning about a third party, all became worthless. The feelings for Tom in this marriage were too overwhelming. I was not sobered by what I showed, only by the piercing pain and shock of love that made me more clear-headed. Tom had corrupted this marriage, and so had I, but our company was still tightly bound to us. Touching one point would affect the entire system. Some things were not simply about divorce. Half a month after learning about Tom's affair, he finally noticed my abnormality. That day, he stood at the door of the study for a long time, finally unable to hold back, and asked, "Jane, what's wrong with you?" Despite trying to tell myself to stay calm, I couldn't continue to share a bed with Tom. For a trivial matter, I chased him to the next room to sleep. For half a month, even the messages he sent me, I replied with a curt tone. Tom, who was naturally suspicious, probably guessed the wrong reason, but I didn't expose it, nor did I make a fuss or make things difficult for that woman over trivial matters. Therefore, the words he wanted to ask clearly reached his lips but were swallowed back down. I rubbed my throbbing temples and continued to attack. Recently, I found problems with the financial reports. Some large and small expenditures didn't match. I knew where those expenditures went, and as the provider, Tom certainly knew better than me. The woman he was supporting outside had just given birth and was still pregnant with her second child. Naturally, economically, she had to be fully provided for. After starting a successful business in his 40s, Tom also had the ability to satisfy her. Tom was obviously stunned for a moment. I saw his right hand hanging by his side clenched tightly, but only for a moment. He regained his composure. Is it because of my spending? I raised my head, my eyes meeting his. He quickly turned away, saying with a lack of confidence, "For the past 2 years, Mark and I have made some small investments. I was afraid you'd worry, so I didn't tell you." Mark was his childhood friend, the person who helped him cover everything up. I didn't press further about what kind of investment it was, and Tom didn't say anything either. He silently knocked on the door and walked out. He guessed I knew about his outside family, but I didn't show any suspicion, as if he thought I would grit my teeth and bear it. In other words, if I didn't endure it, what could I do? If I divorced him now, wouldn't it be a fulfillment for him? Yes, then he would be wealthy with a happy family, maybe even have both sons and daughters, while I, nearing 40, would be alone. Even so, continuing to entangle with such a rotten person was meaningless. I was increasingly uncomfortable having Tom continue to play the role of husband in my life, but the asset transfer was not yet complete. I could only continue the Cold War with him. Perhaps he was waiting for me to figure it out, or perhaps he was waiting for me to propose divorce. No matter what the outcome, I didn't want Tom to be happy. On the 20th day after learning about Tom's affair, I met the woman he was supporting outside. Perhaps she had heard something from Tom, so she came to provoke me. She pretended to coincidentally see me at the coffee shop I frequented. Even the location she chose was the table by the window that I often picked. The people I hired had sent me many photos and videos of her. Just a glance, and I noticed she was still very young, probably around 25 or 26 years old. The clothes she wore and the handbag beside her were all luxury brands, very expensive, probably well taken care of by Tom. She always radiated energy with an innocent and foolish look in her eyes. I suddenly remembered myself at 25. At that time, Tom and I had just been married for over a year. We lived in a cramped rented room with only a meager monthly salary. I didn't know how many years I had worn the clothes on my body. They were so old they were faded. It was during those years that Tom and I worked hard to accumulate the first capital for our business. Late at night, sometimes emotions surged, and he had vowed that he would never betray me. At that time, that promise might have carried some sincerity. Unfortunately, sincerity could not withstand the passage of time. I pretended not to notice her, just as usual, ordered a coffee, and sat at the table in front of her. I didn't even glance at her once. Very quickly, I had to change my view of her when she pulled the chair back. She flashed a provocative smile and said, "You must be Mrs. Tom." Clearly, she knew who I was. It seemed she wasn't deceived into being a mistress but had agreed to be a third party, and now wanted to openly provoke me as a mistress. So what did she know? Everything she was eating and using, half of it belonged to me. I sipped my coffee, my eyes glancing at her slightly protruding chest. "Who are you?" She didn't dare to admit her true identity, still vaguely talking about how she knew me. The reason she gave was very vague. I didn't say much. I looked at her with eyes half smiling, half not. I wanted her to understand that I had seen through her little tricks long ago. A parasite that had been clinging to others for a long time had no power to withstand the storm before my gaze. She couldn't bear it for even half a minute before hastily leaving, her hurried figure revealing a miserable look. I felt pity both for her and for the situation. So young with hands and feet, what couldn't she do? Yet she wanted to become a childbearing tool for someone else. This matter regardless of whether. When Tom came home, he openly moved in with that woman while I also openly began to take action against the company. I knew the company couldn't collapse too quickly, not because I still had any feelings for Tom, but because the twins in that woman's belly were not yet full term. She also had the right to choose to terminate the pregnancy. That wouldn't do. After all, those were 2 lives. Their family of 5 must be complete. On the 9th day since Tom stopped coming home, his mother appeared at my house. This old woman had always been indifferent to me for half her life, just because I couldn't have children. Now she was sitting in the living room with a forced smile, slyly advising me not to argue with Tom. All her living expenses were mostly paid by Tom and me, but in the end, she only thought it was due to her son's talent. Even Tom's affair, in her perception, eventually became something to be proud of. I coldly looked at her, not even bothering to react. Just like before, she spoke in a gentle tone for a while. Finally losing patience, she said, "Jane, you must listen to me. Tom said he doesn't want to divorce you. You should adopt that child as your own. At 2 or 3 years old, children don't know right from wrong. Whoever is kind to them, they will recognize later. They will have to take care of you when you're old." I interrupted her, waving my hand to the door. "If you're done, please leave." Her face darkened, her cloudy eyes staring at me for a moment, then suddenly she laughed. "Jane, you're almost 40 and you don't have a child. At this age, you can't have children anymore. Tell me, if you divorce now, who would want you?" In her outdated and backward concept, a woman must be sought after by a man for her life to have meaning. My eyes swept across the gold chain on her wrist, then stopped on her wrinkled face, which still couldn't hide her arrogance. I gently reminded her, "Tom's behavior is adultery. If I divorce and sue in court, I can make him leave empty-handed." Her face suddenly changed. She glared at me, the white of her eyes more prominent than the pupils, looking a bit scary. "Impossible." Her voice suddenly rose, uncontrollably loud. "Tom has told me many times, even if you divorce, at most you can only get half." Sure enough, Tom had consulted a lawyer from the day he had the affair. He had thought about divorcing me more than once. Seeming to finally realize that what she said was wrong, she slightly softened her tone, but her demeanor was still arrogant. "Jane, you two have such good feelings, you can't divorce. Really, if you divorce, Tom won't regret it, but you will be ridiculed. Yes, you're a woman without children. What's the point of making money when you're old? No one will take care of you. No one will see you off. Her words just kept repeating, going on, only revolving around what would happen to me when I got old. People, if they have enjoyed a few years of prosperity, forget all the difficult days of the past. No problem, let me help them remember. Tom and I no longer had any contact. Our marriage only existed in name. He and that woman became increasingly open, knowing that I couldn't do anything. He even posted photos of his children on social media, very often among relatives and friends. Some began to advise me to endure it for a while, and that everything would pass. It's okay for men with money to go out and have fun. Women still have to know their way home. Friends in the business world advised me to divorce, but most advised me to take advantage of my ability to conceive or do artificial insemination to have a child. Their narrow-minded thinking made me wonder if it was still the new century. Men, after becoming successful, cheat and betray their families. In the eyes of some people, cheating is commonplace. I didn't pay attention to those so-called kind advice. These days, I was not idle. I was looking for Tom's fatal weakness. Perhaps my nonchalant approach had made my best friend Lily extremely angry. She couldn't restrain herself and advised me, "Okay, try your best to see if you can get 80% of the assets. If you make the company bankrupt, wouldn't all your years of hard work be wasted?" I decisively replied, "I always remember what I experienced during this startup process. I will never let anyone enjoy the fruits when I had to pay with sweat and tears." Lily was speechless, finally giving me a thumbs up. "You are the role model of life. I'm here in my business circle. I had my own network. Over the years, many clients were introduced by myself. Even if I failed, I was not without the ability to start over." When that woman was 27 weeks pregnant, the company encountered its first wave of economic crisis. Initially, Tom was not alarmed until he saw that I didn't come forward to solve it, and the situation showed signs of spreading. He began to worry. At this time, he disregarded the Cold War with me and hurriedly called to discuss solutions. Over the years, most of the major and minor issues in the company were discussed and resolved by the two of us together. The dependence I had created had made him take it for granted, making it difficult for him to shoulder everything alone. It was at this point that Tom realized he couldn't contact me. I had blacklisted all his contact methods. Unable to find me, Tom frantically sought out my old friends to inquire about the situation. Finally, with no other choice, he could only stand in front of the gate of our jointly owned properties to block me. To not reveal my intentions too early, when Tom awkwardly blocked my way, I saw all his helplessness. But in the end, I helped him solve this problem. Lily said my actions were no different from washing underwear with cold water. I replied, "Give him a chance, but don't push him into a dead end. That is the greatest pain." The first wave of crisis originated from a batch of company goods being intercepted by customs. The delayed delivery caused the company to suffer a large loss. From then on, Tom no longer had time to be intimate with that woman, nor could he be a good father to his children. I didn't know if Tom trusted me, but even if he suspected me, I didn't care. After the first wave of crisis was resolved, Tom returned to his habit of coming home on time every day. He used this way to communicate with me. From the day he started coming home, I also stopped going home. I stayed in different places every day, sometimes even staying in hotels. Tom couldn't contact or find me, but he also didn't have time to find me because the company was facing the second wave of crisis. This time it involved no small financial problems. If not carefully and accurately calculated, Tom and I might have to spend several years in prison. I was still sober enough to realize that because of a bastard like Tom, having to go to jail was really not worth it. After the tax issue, our company continued to encounter more serious problems. Competitors saw our company weaken and eagerly wanted to step in and share shares. This further accelerated the company's bankruptcy process. As expected, seeing Tom so busy, I felt neither sad nor happy. In a short period of time, Tom couldn't have imagined that the two events leading to the company's bankruptcy were caused by me. Harming the enemy by 1,000 also hurts oneself by 800. To get revenge, I cut off Tom's financial path, and I also cut off my own path. No matter how developed the company was, it couldn't withstand such shocks. On the day the company officially declared bankruptcy, Tom had become the father of 3 children. That woman had given birth to twin boys for him, but now Tom was penniless and heavily in debt. It was said that the woman no longer had the arrogant appearance of before. During her confinement, she cried every day. Her exquisite social media had also been silent for a long time. The children had already been born. They couldn't be put back. But this matter was not over yet. When Tom was so desperate that his hair turned white, I filed a lawsuit to demand the return of all the assets he had spent on that woman. Tom and I were not yet divorced, so the money he spent was still the joint property of the husband and wife. This was also the reason I hadn't talked about divorce with him yet. Every penny he had spent, I would make him return it, every cent completely. It was said that on the day he received the court summons, that woman fainted directly at the hospital. Years of calculation finally came to nothing. In the end, she lost both her husband and all her assets. Truly unbearable. When Tom tried every means to meet me, I was at Lily's house. All the real estate under Tom's and my names had been frozen. Each of us had to bear tens of millions in debt. The phone was almost broken by debt collection calls. We were no longer young. Tom probably understood by now that if we didn't have a miraculous comeback this time, we wouldn't be able to stand up again in this lifetime. This time, he came to me to beg me to withdraw the lawsuit against that woman. He bowed his head, not daring to look directly at me. His demeanor no longer carried a trace of the arrogance of previous quarrels. Jane, she just gave birth. Her health is still not recovered. Could you withdraw the lawsuit? If you want to say useless things, don't open your mouth. I interrupted him, my voice firm, not leaving a trace of room for negotiation. Tom, when you spent that money, did you ever say that half of it was mine and I had the right to demand it back at any time? Of course, Tom had never thought of that, just like he never thought I would be so ruthless. The worst-case scenario he imagined was probably me divorcing him, and then we would have nothing to do with each other anymore. He thought maybe he would be sad for a while after 20 years of affection, but then he would enjoy a happy and successful life. In the end, Tom tried to justify his betrayal. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. I have no choice, Jane. I also had no choice back then. My mother was driving me crazy. I looked at Tom's long hair that had turned gray and the deep wrinkles at his eyebrows, then said to him, Tom, do you remember the year we were most intensely pressured to have children? Tom's mouth twitched for a while before slowly saying 2 words. Remember. In those 2 years, we were forced to have children most intensely. My mother-in-law even moved in with us. She believed that our inability to have children was due to physical problems, bluntly saying she felt my body had problems. She even thought that it wasn't that we didn't want to have children, but that I couldn't give birth. So, she made me go to the hospital for checkups every day. She also found some kind of wild grass from somewhere and brewed it into tea for me to drink, saying it was a folk remedy for major illnesses. At that time, Tom and I had just started our business. Every day we had to deal with all kinds of problems that needed to be handled along with great pressure. I had no mood to face her. Later, unable to bear her anger, Tom even made a fake health check report, telling his mother that the responsibility for not having children was his. I still remember clearly the shocked expression of my mother-in-law, and her hand trembling like a sieve when she received that fake report. Tom had protected me like that. Why could she harm me so much now? In fact, the year the business became successful, I was only 33 years old. If at that time Tom had broken the initial agreement not to have children and said that he wanted a child that belonged to both of us, I could also understand. After all, in the first few years, we were very poor, not even having enough food and clothing for ourselves to give birth to a child to inherit the suffering of parents. But by the age of 33, we had been able to build a stable life. If Tom wanted children, why didn't he say so? Whether he loved youth or pursued novelty, everything had become an irreparable ending. I no longer had the heart to listen to him anymore. Lily and I drove him out, perhaps because of worrying that his illegitimate children would not inherit the. Tom quickly took the child for a DNA test. Currently, those authoritative test results have become important evidence for my divorce case. A week after the company declared bankruptcy, I filed for divorce with the court. The reason for not proposing divorce directly to Tom was that I knew he would definitely not agree. Now we were burdened with huge debts. When life was wealthy, he would seek out others. In this difficult situation, how could he easily let me go? But it's okay. The world would still have people to uphold justice. Lily recounted that when she received the court summons, Tom's expression was even more agitated than that woman's. "Didn't you see that girl was just lying on the sofa? And your ex-mother-in-law even told him not to divorce, saying that you didn't want to divorce him." Really, I don't know where she found the courage to say such words. She sees her son as the most precious thing. I also laughed. I know she's uneducated, but I didn't expect her to be so uneducated. Even when the court had delivered the summons to her son, she still thought I was doing something like seducing and then capturing. Lily suddenly thought of that woman. "Tell me, will that mistress leave Tom this time?" "We'll leave," I continued. "People who have tasted the sweetness of taking shortcuts will not be able to withstand any pressure brought by life." Lily pouted. "She has given birth to 3 sons. Shouldn't she care about the children a little bit?" "I don't have children." Lily was unmarried and had no intention of having children because neither of us understood the so-called legendary maternal love. It was also difficult to comment on this topic. Suing to recover assets from that woman had filled part of the gap in loans, although it was still far from enough. Every day I kept receiving debt collection calls, both for car loans and credit card debts. There were also calls from Tom, who would often call to talk to me. Most of the time, just hearing his voice, I would immediately hang up. But there were also times when I couldn't react in time because Tom's words had once again surprised me with his shamelessness. He said, "Jane, you did everything to bankrupt the company, didn't you? Just because you want me to change my mind? Now I'm willing to come back to the family. Later, I will live good days with you." He even said, "I will make me leave, and the children will all be entrusted to my parents to raise. Later, I guarantee I won't let them bother our lives." I really realize my mistake, Jane. Jane, we have loved each other for nearly 20 years. Can't you give me another chance? Tom really had calculated very well. His so-called making me leave was probably just wanting me to make him suffer again and start a business again. Initially, hearing these words, I still cursed him a few times, but later I decided to let them go in one ear and out the other, not wasting energy cursing anymore. Lily also couldn't bear it anymore, shouting, "Damn it! Why doesn't the sky drop a few lightning bolts to kill him?" Even now, Tom was still dreaming. Who on earth gave him the confidence to think that as long as he wanted to return to the family, I would agree? How ridiculous! I was not recyclable garbage, Ben, because I didn't want him to live well. I even gave up the company. How could I want him? Even a piece of paper thrown in the trash can in a public toilet was cleaner than him. In the time after the company went bankrupt, during sleepless nights, I thought over and over again many times if I had been a little weaker that day, if I hadn't had such a big vengeful heart, if I were the kind of naive heroine in some stories, then my ending would probably be divorce with Tom, each person dividing the assets in half. I live my life, he lives his life. Maybe I would even imagine that after divorce, Tom would suffer from some serious illness, suddenly realizing that the person he loved most was me, and lived the rest of his life in pain of losing true love. But reality was completely not like that. Tom had no great love at all. Just the fact that he abandoned love to pursue novelty was enough to prove that the person he loved most would forever be the next person who brought him the most novelty, a person who already had status. How could he regret losing something he felt was no longer important? He would feel relieved and relaxed when freed from his unimportant past. I had known him since college. I had also witnessed all his suffering and humiliation in the years when he was nobody. But the woman he later sought out was different. She saw his glory and honor when he was successful. Now, only by making Tom forget the things he cherished most, money and fame, would he feel regret. That regret would be deeply ingrained, making him remember it for the rest of his life. The evidence of Tom's affair was sufficient. Even if he didn't want to, this marriage had to end under compulsion. When I walked out of the court, my eyes swept across and saw Tom bowing his head, slumped on the table, speechless. Bankruptcy and old age, heavy debt, and still having to support elderly parents and young children. A total of 7 or 8 mouths to feed. I had wasted half my life with this man. Even if life was initially hard and then happy, the happy years later could not compensate for the suffering I had once experienced. I withdrew my gaze and continued to walk towards the court gate. I saw my ex-mother-in-law and that woman named Mia. The two of them each held a child in their arms, their faces extremely high. They stood a relatively long distance apart, creating a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship that was far from good. How strange. My ex-mother-in-law had desperately wanted grandchildren, and the woman in front of her was the one who had given birth to 3 golden grandsons for her. But in just a few short months of not seeing each other, my ex-mother-in-law looked 10 years older. Her hair, which had been dyed to hide a single gray strand, was now more than half white on top and black on the bottom, looking somewhat old-fashioned. The gold jewelry still worn on her ears and neck had now disappeared. Even the clothes that were originally very neat were now full of wrinkles. The woman named Mia looked no better compared to when I saw her in the coffee shop a few months ago. Today she looked like 2 different people. Her figure had clearly become obese, her face pale and dark circles thick under her eyes. In addition, her hair also looked greasy and matted. It seemed that after the company went bankrupt, no one had a comfortable life. My ex-mother-in-law quickly saw me holding a child in her arms, hurriedly rushing towards me, her mouth constantly spewing vulgarities. Facing an old woman over 60, I didn't feel scared at all. I was about to fight her heartily when Lily, wearing black sunglasses, hurriedly walked over from a distance. She had already waved her hand and called out loudly, "Jane, let's go. Let's settle all your debts." Hearing this, my ex-mother-in-law's eyes widened as if they would pop out. These days living with Tom, she had probably tasted enough of the tricks of debt collectors. Lily and I walked towards the bus stop, leaving behind the heart-rending curses of my ex-mother-in-law. It didn't matter. Who cared? Lily, a genuine second-generation rich kid, was also extremely generous. Tens of millions she said she wanted to borrow, and I gave it to her immediately. But I didn't use her money to pay off debts. The money in my hand was enough to pay off the debts. After divorce and debt sharing, the debt I had to pay was less than Tom's. In addition, I still had a portion of assets sold before the divorce, which was also enough for me to start over. Tom calculated. I calculated. This marriage, why couldn't I recalculate it? Not to mention what I calculated was the family fortune that belonged to myself. After paying off the debts, I didn't rush to start a business again. Instead, I went traveling with Lily to many places. Before I was busy with business, but when Lily asked me to go out, I would say I had no time. Now I had plenty of time. Lily was a second-generation rich kid without ambition. She wasn't good at anything, but her eloquence was extremely outstanding. The two of us wandered outside for nearly half a year until close to the Lunar New Year before returning. Lily had many friends in the circle. The first time traveling for so long, upon returning, she definitely had to organize a gathering. I also went with her. I didn't expect to meet Tom there. When I saw him, he was bowing his head, clasping his hands in front of a fat man, his demeanor full of humility, still trying to force a smile on his face. The fat man I also knew before. He was the representative of one of the distributors for our company. In the past, he was like a gentle Metha Buddha, smiling at everyone. But today, he looked no different from a terrifying Rosa. I still remember that Tom didn't like him back then and said that this person was hypocritical, not sincere enough. I stood a distance away, knowing what the fat man had said to Tom, but seeing him suddenly bow his head lower, the fat man gently pushed him away, straightened his suit buttons and walked away arrogantly. It seemed that Tom's path to starting a business was not smooth. Having to face someone he once despised was truly very uncomfortable, especially for someone with a higher self-esteem than him. But for me, the feeling of satisfaction had reached its peak. Tom stood blankly in place for a while, then bent down to pick up something from the ground. Half bent over, slowly walking out, he didn't turn his head back and didn't see me. It seemed that my decision not to rush to start a business was correct after all. The circle I could enter in the end was also limited. Once I stepped in, I would inevitably meet old acquaintances, friends, or enemies from the past. Since the company went bankrupt, the boundary between friends and enemies had become blurred. When I returned to my room, Lily was attentively listening to her friend talking. Seeing me come back, she immediately waved her hand to call me over. I walked over and just sat down when I heard her say, "I just heard that the phoenix raised by your ex-husband has run away." Sure enough, not long after she returned, I felt puzzled. If she had run away, how could she return? Could it be because she didn't want to leave the 3 children she had given birth to? The friend sitting next to Lily laughed and interjected. It's also not because your ex-mother-in-law is very formidable. It's said that she took the children back to her hometown. Even if she didn't want to return, she had no choice. Surprising. Who knew there would be such a perfect ending? The year my career once again got back on track was the last year of the second year after divorcing Tom. At that time I was 39 years old. It was strange to say that in the past 2 years, although Tom had tried his best, his career had not made any progress. I didn't know from when my ex-mother-in-law found out about my company. She constantly came to the front of the company building to curse me. She was old. The police couldn't do anything, and security guards were even more forbidden to touch her. Not finding anything good to say, she just repeated the curses, calling me a fake chicken that couldn't lay eggs or a useless thing, saying that after the divorce I even made the company bankrupt. Those curses had no effect on me, just the jokes of a fool. I absolutely didn't take them to heart, but this behavior made my mother angry. My mother, a teacher her whole life, was always humble and simple. Even when I was divorced and bankrupt, she never blamed me a word. But when she heard my ex-mother-in-law standing under the company cursing me, for the first time in her life, she abandoned her calm demeanor, angrily arguing with her. A knowledgeable teacher also had advantages when cursing people. No matter how shrewish my ex-mother-in-law was in terms of language, she was no match for my mother. After 2 or 3 days of verbal battles, my ex-mother-in-law was so angry that she had to call an ambulance and then never came back again. My life returned to normal. My mother also didn't mention marriage anymore. At 40 I met a man again. In the same year, Lily, who had regarded marriage as a grave and wanted to be a delicate little princess for life, also found her true love that arrived late. We all had a future worth looking forward to. About Tom and the 10 years after marrying Jane, the business we built was thriving day by day. My mother urged me to go to the hospital for checkups more and more often. Every day, she brewed several bowls of traditional medicine, even more precious than ginseng, forcing me to drink. I didn't want to drink. Every time my mother would cry, lamenting how hard she had worked to raise me. She also said that if Jane and I didn't have a child, what was the point of making so much money? Later, when we passed away, no one would take care of our funerals. Those words initially I didn't pay attention to because the education I received told me that living in this world was not just for continuing the family line. It was also because of this that in the most difficult year of my startup journey, I had told Jane about my intention not to have children. I thought she would hesitate. I didn't think she would reluctantly agree. She added that if having children was for them to continue my hard life, then not having children was also a form of kindness. In fact, Jane also didn't want to have children. The startup journey was indeed too difficult. Many times I wanted to give up, but it was Jane who made me persevere. She said that doing anything was inevitable to fail. Fortunately, we overcame it and became very successful. After becoming successful, hearing my mother mention the urge to have children, its meaning was completely different from before. What my mother said was also not wrong. If we didn't have children, wouldn't the family fortune we built fall into the pockets of others? It was not difficult to understand why recently my cousins came and went very frequently. They even said they would let their children come to my house to play. I began to regret not having children. I also didn't know how to open my mouth to Jane. She had devoted all her energy to the company. How could she not have children? In the end, I couldn't resist the temptations outside. My best friend Mark introduced me to a completely fresh college girl, 21 years old, her skin smooth as if you could squeeze water out of it. I liked her very much. I didn't want to cross the line, and I also didn't want to leave Jane. Mark also advised me that marriage and love didn't necessarily have to be one or the other. Other friends also said the same thing. Tom, how can a man not have a confidant? As long as we don't tell your wife, probably she won't know. I slipped and had an illegitimate child. My mother was extremely happy, holding the child and constantly cursing Jane for being evil-hearted, saying why she couldn't have children. I didn't say anything. Actually, it was because I didn't take responsibility for myself at that time. I always wanted to protect Jane, not letting my mother make things difficult for her. After having a child, I thought over and over again about Jane's feelings. If she knew, every scene I imagined would hurt me. The pain would make my heart ache, even to the point of not wanting to live anymore. She had endured so much suffering with me. I didn't want to betray her, so I cooperated with my parents and best friends to perfectly cover it up from Jane, not revealing a single flaw. Over the years, the feeling of guilt in me gradually faded. My child was 2 years old. She still hadn't found anything unusual. One day, my mother no longer urged me to have children anymore. The company had a revenue of tens of millions. Even if Jane found out and wanted a divorce, I would also have a considerable fortune. Actually, in my heart, I also thought that Jane didn't want a divorce. She had no children and was also getting older. If she wanted to have children, she might not be able to anymore. I still thought that if, after knowing the truth, Jane agreed to this slightly deviated marriage, at least the child could take care of her in her older age. If she didn't agree, then divorce. Everyone goes their own way. Each person has their own happiness. Maybe in my heart, I would feel a little regret for the youth that had passed and the marriage later. After all, we had once loved each other deeply, unforgettable in our youth. But what could stop the changes of time? Jane had known everything. She didn't expose me, nor did she make a scene, just using an excuse to pull me into the guest room to sleep. At this moment, I realized that her not making a scene was because she was afraid things would become complicated and difficult to resolve. I believed she would forgive me, but she made a scene, using all vulgar language to curse me. I angrily called her a shrew and asked her to stop, then turned around and left the house. I never thought that she would choose such a ruthless way, not hesitating to hurt herself even to harm me more. She didn't mention divorce, and the company, after facing one crisis after another, finally dissolved. I knew there was her hand in it, but besides anger, I didn't know what to say to blame her. The company was built by us working together, but the one who betrayed the marriage was me. It wasn't that I had never thought about the consequences, but that I didn't think she would be so ruthless. In this moment, I truly regretted it. Compared to having children, I was more afraid of going back to the poor days of the past, but Jane was completely not afraid. That's right. She was the one who had experienced hardship, bit by bit, to overcome it. She was not afraid of returning to a poor life because she was very strong, not afraid of any challenges, and she would try to overcome all challenges. The person who had to return to the poor days from beginning to end was only me. If I had her by my side, maybe I wouldn't be so afraid. But I knew for sure that from now on, she would no longer accompany me.